For almost a century, the United States of America has provided an active participation and leadership role in world politics. Since the end of World War I, the U.S. has presented itself as a united country, long since healing wounds of the past. Yet it was not always so. In the late 18 and early 1900s, the United States of America remained an internally focused nation. Because of the Civil War, unification seemed a far-off hope, and ideas of a truly united states remained only in the minds of a few progressive thinkers. Several years passed, and in 1914, when World War I broke out, the U.S. watched from the sideline as terror reigned in Europe. That was until one man convinced Woodrow Wilson to enter. Walter Hines Page, who served both as a progressive thinker in a conservative South and an influential ambassador consistently arguing against neutrality, was this man. During the mid-1800s, debates about slavery raged throughout the United States, and in 1861, tensions finally came to a head during the Civil War. The war seemed to mark a line horizontally across the U.S., dividing North from South. The North and South fought on until 1865, and although the war was over, many areas were still ravaged and full of hatred. Because of the still present divide, government policies were focused mainly upon internal conflicts, while ignoring external ones. This was the USA, a mainly isolationist country, and not yet a force in world politics. Six years before the start of the Civil War, in 1855, Walter Hines Page was born in Cary, a small town outside of Raleigh, North Carolina. Page completed primary schooling and moved on to study at several colleges including Trinity College, Macon College, and Johns Hopkins. Page had a message to share, one of a progressive South, but was unsure of how to get that message in the minds of Southerners. In 1880, he finally decided that journalism would be his best option. Page excelled as a journalist and offered his ideas about Southern economic and social problems. His ideas on Reconstruction found their way into the New York World, the Raleigh State Chronicle, Atlantic Monthly, the New York Forum, and the World's Work. Page's arguments were controversial, as he blatantly told Southerners to stop worrying about the dead Confederate soldiers and look towards the future. For over 30 years, Page wrote about such issues, attempting to find solutions to age-old problems. His actions pertaining to a progressive South soon caused more opportunities to open up for him as Woodrow Wilson ran for president. 1912 was an election year, and Woodrow Wilson was competing with Republican incumbent William Taft. Page agreed with many of Wilson's ideas, and soon all of Page's articles were slanted in Wilson's favor. Meeting personally with Page, a friendship was created between the two, and this friendship was strengthened when Wilson won the election. In 1913, Woodrow Wilson appointed Walter Hines Page as ambassador to Great Britain. In 1913, Page took his first steps to St. James Park in Great Britain, where he would act as ambassador for several years. British officials, such as Lord Edward Grey, became close personal friends with Page, and he was largely successful in creating a friendly relationship with Great Britain. However, due to a convoluted alliance system in Europe, as well as the murder of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the war in Europe seemed inevitable. On August 4, 1914, Lord Grey summoned Page. "I have asked you to come to tell you that this morning we sent an ultimatum to Germany. There will be war." Just 2 months later, on June 14, 1914, World War I began. Great Britain entered alongside France and Russia, thus forming the Triple Entente, or the Allies. Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy fought bitterly against them as the Central Powers. These mighty powers clashed, and trench warfare as well as naval battles soon ensued. Chaos reigned throughout Europe because of new and more vicious war weapons, such as the rifle, flamethrower, tank, and mustard gas. Not much headway was made due to the fact that both sides remained deadlocked, each having equal amounts of force. Upon the outbreak of war, Page immediately urged President Wilson to join the Allies, for it was a war on democracy, as he said. He, like the British, saw the advancing Central Powers as a threat to the balance of industrialized nations. Defending the British policies, Page continued an onslaught of facts and reasons the USA should enter World War I, yet to no avail. President Wilson remained adamant with his policies and preached about the spirit of impartiality to the American citizens. Wilson was acting upon an idea stated in President Washington's farewell address: isolationism. Isolationism is the idea in which the United States would not enter European wars in order to maintain unity as well as preserve the power of the country. Wilson agreed with this neutrality. His argument was based on the fact that many U.S. citizens were from different European countries, and thus supporting one side or another would cause a crippling divide in our relatively young nation. Battles raged on in Europe, yet no change in wartime policy occurred in the U.S. In March of 1917, Page sent a telegram to President Wilson blatantly stating that without the U.S.'s help, the French front would be crushed and the Central Powers would win the war. At the bottom of this telegram, Page wrote this cryptic message: "Unless Germany modifies her plan and exempts all American ships, we shall soon have war. We must go in. If no action is taken, it will be like a great blot in history, or a failure that must grievously depress the future of America." Although not entirely factual, this caused Wilson to have second thoughts, and in 1917, after the sinking of the Lusitania by British U-boats, President Wilson's ideas finally shifted. There are, it may be, many months of fiery trial and sacrifice ahead of us. It is a fearful thing to lead this great peaceful people into war, into the most terrible and disastrous of all wars, civilization itself seeming to be in the balance. But the right is more precious than peace, and we shall fight for things which we have always carried nearest to our hearts, for democracy. America is privileged to spend her blood and her might for the principles that gave her birth and happiness and the peace which she has treasured. God helping her, she can do no other. Quickly meeting with British politicians, Page had the wartime document signed, and the USA was officially an ally. At Page's urging, millions of American troops aided their comrades on the Western Front, and especially naval battles, 2 million alone arriving in France. Page watched as his actions finally had an effect on history, as the Allies soon took hold of the First World War.
The U.S. was really very late getting to World War I and wasn't particularly effective in World War I, but because it was a war of attrition that was so tightly balanced, the U.S. Impact, especially in the very, very last stages of the war, was surely important.
Like Professor Wertheimer said, the U.S. entering tipped the balance of the war. Yet, in late 1918, before the war was finished, Page fell gravely ill and was forced to resign. Meanwhile, the Allies were defeating the Central Powers, and by November 11, 1918, all of the Central Powers had surrendered, and Germany had signed the Treaty of Versailles. The fighting was over, yet the war would claim one more life. On December 21, 1918, Walter Hines Page died. Despite the fact that Page was dead, his memory and legacy were still very much alive. Page had accomplished the mighty feat of convincing Woodrow Wilson to enter World War I, and without the United States' help, the war would have remained deadlocked for several months, perhaps even years. The Central Powers might have won, and the war on democracy would have been lost. British and Americans recognized Page's sacrifice, and soon a memorial was dedicated to him in Westminster Abbey, the only place fit for him, as Lord Grey stated. At his eulogy, a friend and fellow colleague, Grattan, stated, "He was a great citizen. He gave his life for his country. Such a life as his should be held up as a model to all generations." Before World War I, Page attempted to heal old wounds of the South. He was a progressive who dreamed of a truly United States. His ideas were not met in his lifetime, but were continued afterwards. During World War I, he influenced Woodrow Wilson and ultimately helped convince him to enter the war, thus allowing the Allies to be victorious. Yet this action had another legacy, bringing the United States onto the world stage. World War I was the first major appearance of the U.S. in the global political arena, and this initial experience was the beginning of the United States becoming a major world power. Without World War I, the United States may have adhered to Washington's isolationist policy and never have become a world political power. These actions gave way to legacies, as his memory was forever remembered through his memorials, as well as through the world power that is the United States of America.